White plays the move pawn to c4, aiming to challenge and attack your center. You defend it solidly with your pawn, maintaining control. Next, white usually develops with knight to c3. It doesn't attack anything immediately, but it adds extra pressure to your central pawn. In response, you play a symmetrical move, knight to f6, reinforcing your center and developing your piece. At this point, white often continues with knight to f3 or bishop to g5. Both are standard developing moves and will appear in the game sooner or later. For example, if white plays bishop to g5, you can calmly respond with bishop to e7, neutralizing the pin on your knight and preparing to castle. After that, white develops with knight to f3, and you proceed to castle kingside. White then usually plays pawn to a3, opening the diagonal for their light-squared bishop. Notice that within just a few moves, you've already castled, ensuring your king's safety very early in the game, which is ideal for any opening. Before continuing to develop your queenside pieces, it's highly recommended to include the move pawn to h6. This is a universal idea. Whenever your opponent places a bishop on g5, playing pawn to h6 to drive it away is almost always a good and safe move in any opening. If white decides to capture on f6 with the bishop, that actually works in your favor. You'll gain the two bishops advantage, which is generally considered a positional plus. In most cases, a bishop is slightly stronger than a knight, so this exchange benefits you. Therefore, there's no need to worry. In fact, you'd welcome that trade. If instead the bishop retreats, that's also fine. You've just played a useful move, pawn to h6, gaining a tempo by forcing the bishop to move. It also provides your king with an escape square, meaning you'll never have to worry about back rank checkmate issues later in the game. Additionally, this move controls the g5 square, preventing any future piece activity there. All in all, pawn to h6 is a very useful and multi-purpose move. Now, your next task is to develop your queenside pieces, which are still passive. Your light-squared bishop is currently blocked by your pawn on e6, so we want to develop it more effectively. The best plan is to fianchetto the bishop by playing pawn to b6, preparing bishop to b7. This setup, often called the Queen's Gambit declined fianchetto system or Tartakower defense, is extremely solid. It resolves the tension between the central pawns and places your bishop on a long, active diagonal where it will exert strong pressure and play an important role in the middle game. After that, we play pawn to b6, preparing to fianchetto our light-squared bishop. At this moment, white reaches a key decision point. The classic chess question, to take or not to take. White can either capture on d5 with pawn takes d5, or simply continue developing with bishop to d3, keeping the central tension. At the beginner and intermediate levels, most players tend to capture on d5, while stronger players often prefer to maintain the tension and keep developing. For now, let's examine the first option. Pawn takes d5. Now it's your turn to decide how to recapture. While you could take back with the pawn, it's actually stronger to recapture with the knight. Here's why. There's a fundamental strategic rule in chess. When your position has slightly less space or feels cramped, it's usually beneficial to exchange some pieces. This gives your remaining pieces more room to maneuver and makes your position easier to play. Since our position is still relatively compact, most of our pieces are on the back two ranks. We welcome exchanges. That's why knight takes d5 is the best choice. It not only offers a trade of knights, relieving pressure, but also opens up the diagonal for your bishop, improving your piece activity. Typically, white will respond by trading on d7 as well, continuing the sequence and keeping the position balanced but comfortable for you. After the exchanges on d5, several pieces are traded, and your position becomes much more open and free. Your pieces now have better lines and diagonals to operate on. White still needs to continue development, so they usually play bishop to d3. Instead of developing passively, you can immediately strike back in the center with pawn to c5. This is actually the second purpose behind your earlier move, pawn to b6. Not only does it prepare to fianchetto your bishop, but it also supports this strong central push. Once again, white faces a choice, to take on c5 or maintain the tension. In most cases, they capture, pawn takes c5. Here, it's very important that you recapture with the pawn, not with the queen. If you play queen takes c5, you'll end up with an isolated pawn on d5, giving white a long-term positional advantage. Their knight can jump to the strong d4 square, and their rook could pressure your queen along the open c-file, all of which would make your position much weaker. Therefore, the correct move is pawn takes c5. Now your central pawns on c5 and d5 work perfectly together, controlling key squares and forming what's known as hanging pawns, a powerful structure that gives you both space and attacking potential, even though they require careful defense. These hanging pawns on c5 and d5 have both strengths and weaknesses. Their main advantage is that they control many central squares and can advance later to create strong attacking chances. The downside is that white might try to target them, but as long as you know how to handle them, they're perfectly safe. White will usually castle kingside here, and now there's an important idea to remember. In this position, it's not ideal to place your bishop on b7 right away. Earlier, when we planned to fianchetto, it was based on the assumption that the pawn on d5 might eventually be exchanged, allowing the bishop to work actively along the long diagonal. However, since white's pawn on c4 has already been traded, your pawn on d5 is now fixed and can't be exchanged easily. That means if you develop the bishop to b7 now, it would be blocked by your own pawn. So it's better to delay this move and find a more effective way to activate your bishop later. If you develop your bishop to b7, it becomes quite passive since the pawn on d5 blocks its diagonal. A better plan is to place the bishop on e6, where it actively supports the d5 pawn and controls key central squares. White will usually continue with rook to c1, adding pressure to your c5 pawn. It's not a serious threat yet, but you can strengthen your defense with knight to d7, keeping your position stable and flexible. From here, white might try moves like queen to c2 or bishop to b1, aiming for future kingside pressure. To stay ahead, play rook from f8 to c8. This reinforces your c5 pawn, prepares for counterplay along the c-file, and places your rook on a perfect active square for the upcoming middle game, when white play queen to c2. A good response is knight to f6. This move not only places your knight on a strong central square, but also helps defend the d5 pawn. At the same time, your rook on c8 becomes very important. Without it, white could capture your c5 pawn because their queen is defending the pawn attacking it. This shows why rook to c8 was such a useful and necessary move earlier. It supports your pawn and prepares your rook for active play along the c-file. Looking at your overall plan, you can bring your other rook to the b-file. From there, it can put pressure on white's b2 pawn, which is a common weakness in these positions. If white responds with pawn to b3 to defend, it's not a problem. In fact, this can even work in your favor because it slightly weakens their queenside structure. You can then start pushing your pawn with a 5 followed by a 4, opening lines for your rooks and increasing pressure on their queenside. Even if you temporarily sacrifice a pawn on the a-file, it's usually safe. You can defend and regain it later using your queen, for example, moving it to a 7 or d7, and target the weak a4 and a 2 pawns. Once you capture on a 4, the a2 pawn often becomes weak too, giving you further chances to attack. Meanwhile, your c-pawn has the potential to become a strong passed pawn, and your knight can occupy key central squares, coordinating well with your other pieces. Overall, your position becomes very active, and your pieces work together to create strong pressure on the queenside. This way, you steadily outplay white, who may be making natural-looking moves but doesn't have a clear plan, while your coordinated play and pressure give you a clear advantage.